The night of the terrifying dream. The night was thick with silence, the only sounds in Adan's small apartment coming from the distant chirping of crickets and the faint whir of a ceiling fan struggling against the humid air. The darkness outside was deep, untouched by streetlights or the glow of a full moon. Adan tossed and turned in her bed, her breath uneven, her fingers clutching the sheets. Then, it happened again. The dream. She found herself standing in the middle of a strange, desolate village. The air was thick, heavy, as though something unnatural weighed it down. The sky was a deep shade of red, unnatural and eerie, casting long, ghostly shadows across the landscape. The huts around her were empty, their doors swaying slightly as though unseen hands were pushing them. A whisper called through the wind. Then a presence. A faceless figure emerged from the darkness, its form long and shadowy, wielding a burning staff that hissed and cracked like a living thing. The flames did not flicker, they burned still and deep, a color she could not name, something beyond human fire. Adan's heart pounded as she turned to run, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to stretch endlessly. No matter how fast she moved, the village refused to end, the huts repeating in an unnatural loop. She ran. And ran. But this time was different. Before, she had always woken up just before the figure caught her. But tonight, it was faster. A cold hand, long fingers, inhuman and strong, clasped her wrist, yanking her backward. She fell hard against the dusty ground, her breath knocked from her lungs. The faceless figure loomed over her, the burning staff lowering toward her stomach. She wanted to scream. She wanted to wake up. But she couldn't. The fiery end of the staff touched her abdomen. A white-hot pain exploded through her body as an invisible force carved something deep into her skin. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Adan's scream finally ripped through the night. And she woke up. She bolted upright, her entire body drenched in sweat, her breath ragged and uneven. A sharp, searing pain shot through her stomach, as though something was still branding her from the inside. She clutched her abdomen, gasping. The pain was real. Her hands trembled as she lifted the hem of her nightshirt. Her blood ran cold. A mark, a deep, fiery symbol, glowed faintly on her skin, still hot to the touch. Her entire body shook as panic wrapped around her like a suffocating fog. Adan. Her roommate, Nkechi, stirred from the other side of the room, her voice laced with concern. She turned on the bedside lamp, her eyes widening at the sight of Adan clutching her stomach in pain. Adan, what's wrong? Nkechi rushed to her side, placing a hand on her burning forehead. Adan opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, a choked, pain gasp escaped her lips. And then, a wave of unbearable pain tore through her body, stronger than anything she had ever felt. She collapsed, convulsing, her vision blurring as her world began to tilt. Nkechi barely caught her before she hit the floor. We need to get to the hospital. Nkechi's voice was frantic as she struggled to lift Adan's weak, trembling form. She dragged her toward the door, throwing on a wrapper over her nightgown, not caring about the time of night. The streets were empty, but she managed to flag down a passing motorcyclist, pleading desperately for help. The last thing Adan saw before everything faded to black was Nkechi's terrified face as the world around her spiraled into darkness. The shocking discovery. The emergency ward of St. Luke's Hospital buzzed with activity. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the white-tiled floors as doctors and nurses moved between patients, their voices a blend of urgency and exhaustion. Inside, Adan lay unconscious on a hospital bed, her body damp with sweat, her breathing shallow and labored. Nkechi sat beside her, her hands shaking as she watched her best friend. A young nurse, Amaka, entered the ward, her trained eyes scanning the room. She was in her mid-20s, relatively new to the hospital but sharp and observant. Something about Adan's condition unsettled her. The girl's skin was pale, and her abdomen twitched involuntarily, as though something inside her was alive. Frowning, Amoka stepped closer. "Has she regained consciousness at all?" she asked, directing the question to Nkechi. "No," Nkechi whispered, wiping tears from her eyes. "She was screaming in pain before she passed out. Please, help her." Amoka nodded and adjusted her gloves. She placed her hand on Adan's wrist to check her pulse. It was weak but steady. But when she moved to check Adan's abdomen, she noticed something disturbing. The skin above her navel was unnaturally hot, almost burning through the latex of her gloves. "Dr. Okafor should be here soon," another nurse said, walking past. "Stabilize her until then." Amoka swallowed hard and took a deep breath. Carefully, she lifted Adan's hospital gown to examine her lower stomach. Her eyes widened. A mark, a deep, glowing red symbol, was carved into her skin. It pulsed faintly, as though alive. What in God's name is this? She had never seen anything like it. "Doctor, you need to see this," Amoka called, her voice tight with unease. The nurse beside her only chuckled. "Don't waste your energy. It's probably one of those girls who took a concoction to end a pregnancy and messed up her body. Just inject her and move on." Amoka turned sharply. "She's not some careless girl. Something is wrong with her. This isn't normal." Ignoring the nurse's dismissive tone, Amoka reached for a fresh pair of gloves and took a deep breath. She had to check for internal injuries. When she gently spread Adan's legs to examine her, she froze. Her blood ran cold. Inside, tiny, writhing creatures, black, insect-like things with clawed legs and eyeless faces, squirmed in thick, darkened blood, feeding on her flesh. A terrible smell filled the air, rotten, decayed, and unnatural. Amoka's vision blurred. Her stomach churned violently. She stumbled away, barely making it to the restroom before she vomited into the sink. Her body shook uncontrollably, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had just seen. How is this possible? What kind of disease is this? She wiped her mouth, breathing heavily. She had seen wounds before. She had seen infections, miscarriages, and terrible injuries. But nothing like this. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps filled the corridor. Dr. Okafor, the head doctor, rushed in, still dressed in his evening clothes. He had been called in for an emergency, and the serious look on his face showed he was ready to take charge. "Where is the patient?" he demanded. "In here," Amoka whispered, still shaking. Dr. Okafor entered the ward and immediately saw Adan's frail body on the bed. His medical instincts kicked in, but as soon as he got closer, he noticed the pulsing mark on her stomach. His brows furrowed. He lifted her gown slightly to inspect the lower area. And his entire body stiffened when he saw what lay between her legs. A flicker of something passed across his face, something he rarely showed. Fear. But unlike Amoka, he didn't flinch. His years of experience made him push aside his emotions. "This is beyond a medical issue," he murmured under his breath. Then, louder, he instructed, "Bring me the surgical kit and a full scan immediately. Also, call in Dr. Oki for a second opinion." Meanwhile, just outside the ward, two nurses stood whispering in hushed voices. "You see how they're all running around? It's obvious she tried to remove a pregnancy by herself. Now, look at the mess she's in." The second nurse scoffed. "These young girls of today, always playing with fire. And now, see what has happened. It serves her right." They giggled quietly, shaking their heads as though they knew the full story. But they didn't. No one did. Inside the ward, as Dr. Okafor walked, Adan's fingers twitched. Her lips moved, whispering something incoherent. No one noticed it at first. Then, a low, A human growl escaped from her throat. And the lights in the hospital flickered. A mystery beyond medicine. The hospital air felt thick, as if something unseen lingered in the corners, pressing against the sterile walls. Dr. Okafor sat at her desk, frowning at the screen in front of her. The test results had come back. Everything was normal. Her blood work. Clean. Her vitals. Stable. Her scans. Completely normal. And yet, nothing was normal about Adan. Dear. Okafor leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Decades in medicine had taught her how to recognize unusual cases, but this was something else entirely. Her mind flashed back to what she had seen between the young woman's legs, tiny, writhing creatures feeding on blackened blood. And yet, the test results claimed there was nothing wrong with her. Science is failing me, she thought grimly. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she said. Nurse Amoka stepped in, her face still pale from earlier. Doctor, she's awake. Dr. Okafor stood immediately, pushing away her lingering unease. Let's go. The awakening. Adan's eyelids fluttered as she slowly regained consciousness. The room was dim, with only the faint beeping of hospital monitors filling the silence. Nkechi was by her bedside, gripping her hand tightly. You're awake. Oh, thank God. Adan tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She looked around in confusion, her heartbeat quickening as flashes of her nightmare rushed back to her. The faceless figure. The burning staff. The unbearable pain. And then, the creatures. She shuddered. Adan, a calm voice said. She turned her head and saw Dr. Okafor standing beside her, clipboard in hand, her eyes sharp but kind. How are you feeling? Adan hesitated, swallowing hard. Better, she whispered. But her voice betrayed her fear. I ran several tests on you, Dr. Okafor continued. And the results say you're perfectly healthy. Adan's lips trembled. That's not possible. I know, Dr. Okafor admitted. That's why I need you to tell me exactly what happened before all of this started. A long silence stretched between them. For a moment, Adan considered lying, pretending she didn't remember, hoping this nightmare would just end. But then, she felt it, a dull pain in her stomach, like a cruel reminder. She took a shaky breath. It started a week ago. Dr. Okafor and Amoka exchanged glances but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Adan stared at the ceiling as she spoke, as if afraid to meet their eyes. Every night, I had the same dream. I was in a strange village, and a faceless figure would chase me. At first, I always escaped. But last night, he caught me. Her hands clenched into weak fists. He burned me. Right here. She lifted her hospital gown slightly, revealing the mark on her abdomen. Nkechi gasped softly. Dr. Okafor, who had seen the mark up close before, still felt a strange chill when she looked at it now. The skin was unscarred, but the symbol seemed carved into her flesh, as if it were not made by human hands. I woke up screaming, Adan continued. And the pain was real. Then everything got worse. Dr. Okafor's fingers tapped the clipboard thoughtfully. Tell me, Adan, is there anything that happened before the dream started? A new person in your life? A place you visited? Adan stiffened. A shadow flickered across her face. Dr. Okafor immediately noticed. What is it? She asked gently. Adan hesitated, but before she could speak, a violent spasm ripped through her body. She convulsed, her back arching unnaturally. Adan! Nkechi screamed. The machines beeped wildly, alarms blaring. Blood seeped from her nose, ears, and mouth, thick and dark as ink. Her hospital gown turned crimson, and something moved beneath the sheets. Nurse Amoka gasped in horror. Dr. Okafor immediately snapped into action. Hold her down. Get another sedative. Amoka rushed to grab supplies, but before she could inject Adan, the creatures returned. Tiny, dark figures crawled out of Adan's body, their sharp legs wriggling in the pool of black blood. The air turned ice cold, and the lights flickered. Something was here. Dr. Okafor gritted her teeth. Enough. She had seen enough cases in the past to know when she was out of her depth. This was beyond medicine. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. After 2 rings, an old, steady voice answered. Dr. Okafor, the man on the other end said. I was expecting your call. She clenched the phone tightly. Boba Chokudi. I have a case that defies everything I know. I need your help. The line was silent for a moment. Then Boba Chokudi's voice came, calm but heavy with meaning. Tell me, does she bear a mark? Dr. Okafor stiffened. Yes. Another pause. Then, Boba Chokudi exhaled. She has been claimed, doctor. This is no sickness. This is a curse. The truth about the man she loved. The hospital air had changed. It was no longer just the scent of antiseptic and medicine, something else lingered now. A thick, invisible presence, pressing against the walls, filling the empty spaces. Dr. Okafor felt it. Amoka felt it. Even Kechi, though unfamiliar with such things, noticed how the room had turned unnaturally cold. Then, the door opened. Boba Chokudi stepped inside. He was an old man, dressed in simple robes, his head wrapped in a faded cloth. His hands were dark with age, calloused from years of healing, from battles fought against things that should not exist. His eyes, however, were sharp as a hawk's. He scanned the room slowly, taking in Adan's frail form on the hospital bed. He exhaled softly. I smell death in this room. Dr. Okafor, ever the scientist, stiffened slightly but said nothing. She had called him because she knew there were things that medicine could not explain. Boba Chokudi stepped closer to the bed and placed a hand on Adan's forehead. The moment he touched her, her body twitched violently. Her lips parted, but instead of a scream, a low, unnatural growl emerged from deep within her throat. Boba Chokudi did not flinch. Instead, he closed his eyes, muttering something under his breath. Words that did not belong to this world. As he spoke, the lights flickered again. The darkness outside the window seemed to press against the glass, as if trying to force its way inside. Then, suddenly, Adan gasped, her eyes flying open. Her breath was ragged, her pupils dilated in sheer terror. But Boba Chokudi held her in place, his voice calm but firm. Who gave you this mark? He asked, his gaze never leaving hers. Adan trembled. She knew what he was asking. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Boba Chokudi did not move. Child, did you lie with a man before this curse began? Dr. Okafor and Amoka exchanged tense glances. Nkechi held Adan's hand tightly. Adan hesitated. Then, her body shook as silent tears streamed down her face. I didn't want to, her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. I had no choice. Dr. Okafor leaned forward, her voice soft. Who was he? Adan swallowed hard. Her fingers gripped the hospital blanket like a lifeline. Obina. The name fell like a stone in the room. Who is he? Boba Chokudi asked. A businessman, Adan whispered. Wealthy, powerful. He had been pursuing me for months. Sending gifts, calling me, telling me he loved me. But I already had someone. I ignored him. She squeezed her eyes shut as if trying to block out the memory. But then, my father fell sick. He needed an urgent surgery. We didn't have the money. She sniffed, guilt heavy in her voice. My boyfriend, he tried to help, but he didn't have enough. I asked my boss for a salary advance, but he refused. She looked up at them, her eyes filled with shame. I was desperate. A silence settled over the room. Dr. Okafor spoke gently. And then Obinna appeared. Adan nodded, her whole body shaking. He said he would give me the money. No loans, no conditions. Just a gift. But only if I spent one night with him. Her voice broke. I wanted to say no. But I thought, just one night. Just once. My father's life was worth more than my pride. Tears spilled down her cheeks. So, I agreed. Baba Chukwudi's face remained unreadable, but his fingers clenched into fists. Tell me everything. Do not leave out a single detail. Adan took a shaky breath. We met at a hotel. A very expensive one. He was kind. Charming. He treated me like a queen. But she bit her lip. Something was off. Dr. Okafor's brows furrowed. Off how? Adan hesitated. The hotel room had no mirrors. The words sent a strange chill through the air. There was no running water in the bathroom. No taps, no shower. Just a bowl of water by the bedside. Baba Chukwudi closed his eyes, murmuring something under his breath. And when we were done, Adan continued, her voice barely above a whisper, he gave me 3 times the money I asked for. A shudder ran through her body. And then, he vanished. Dr. Okafor frowned. What do you mean, vanished? Adan shook her head helplessly. I called him the next day to thank him, but his number was switched off. I tried again and again, but it was like he never existed. She let out a bitter laugh. I didn't care. I had the money. My father had the surgery. I thought everything was fine. Her expression darkened. But then, that very night, the dream started. The room was dead silent. No one spoke. Then, Baba Chukwudi sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. He turned to Dr. Okafor. This is not just a sickness. This is not just a case of bad luck. His voice was grim. This man did not give her money. He took something from her in return. Dr. Okafor felt a deep unease settle in her chest. Her body is still here, Baba Chukwudi continued. But her spirit is already halfway gone. A cold wind blew through the room, though no windows were open. Dr. Okafor's hands clenched around her clipboard. Baba, she asked carefully, what does that mean? Baba Chukwudi's expression darkened. It means, he said, voice low, that if we don't act fast, she will not live to see the next full moon. The fight for Adan's life. The hospital ward was silent, heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. The lights overhead flickered, the air thick with an unseen presence. Baba Chukwudi stood at the center of the room, his weathered hands carefully arranging the items for the cleansing ritual. On the table before him lay a small clay pot filled with blessed herbs, a burning white candle, and a bowl of salt water infused with protective charms. Dr. Okafor watched with her arms folded, trying to mask her unease. Science had failed her today. She had no choice but to step into a world she had spent her life ignoring. Beside her, Nurse Amoka held a small bottle of anointed oil, her knuckles white from gripping it too hard. She was afraid but refused to let it show. Adan lay motionless on the hospital bed, her skin too pale, her breaths too shallow. Nkechi sat by her side, whispering silent prayers, her hands shaking. Baba Chukwudi exhaled, closing his eyes. Then he spoke. This battle will not be easy. He turned to Dr. Okafor, his deep-set eyes serious. The forces tied to this man, Obinna, are strong. They will not let her go without a fight. Dr. Okafor nodded stiffly. Then let's fight. Baba Chukudi took a deep breath, then lifted a small calabash of water and began to chant. His voice was low and firm, the words rolling off his tongue like an ancient song. Then the room changed. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered wildly, casting long, unnatural shadows on the walls. Then, a violent wind howled through the hospital. The windows slammed open, though there was no storm outside. Paperwork flew into the air, medical equipment crashed to the ground. A deep, guttural laughter echoed through the room. Then, from the darkest corners of the ward, two shadowy figures emerged. They were tall, cloaked in black mist, their glowing red eyes filled with malice. They did not walk, they glided, as though the air itself carried them. One of them tilted its head toward Baba Chukudi. "Meddling old man," it sneered, its voice slithering through the air. "She belongs to us." The second figure's eyes landed on Adan's weak, trembling body. It reached out a skeletal hand toward her. "Her soul is already marked," it hissed. "You cannot save her." Nkechi let out a strangled whimper, grabbing Adan's hand. "She's not yours. Leave her alone." Baba Chukudi stepped forward, unfazed. He raised his hand and threw a handful of blessed salt into the air. The moment the grains touched the shadows, the creature screeched in pain, recoiling as if burned. "She is not yours," Baba Chukudi thundered. "In the name of the ancestors, in the name of the Most High, I rebuke you." The spirits shuddered violently, but they did not leave. Instead, they attacked. The room shook violently, as though the entire hospital was caught in an earthquake. The machines beeped wildly, glass shattered, and Adan screamed. Her body convulsed, rising off the bed as if an unseen force was pulling her upward. "Hold her down," Dr. Okafor shouted. Amoka and Nkechi rushed forward, pressing Adan back onto the bed as she thrashed violently, her eyes rolling back. Then, black smoke erupted from her mouth, her nose, her ears. The creatures inside her were fighting back. Baba Chukudi grabbed the bowl of anointed water and flung it across Adan's body. The moment the drops touched her skin, the spirit screamed in agony. The shadows lurched backward, riding as if something was burning them alive. But they did not leave. One of them turned to Dr. Okafor, its voice filled with malice. "You do not belong here, woman of science," it whispered. "This is beyond your world." Dr. Okafor took a deep breath, then did something she never thought she would. She grabbed the anointed oil from Amoka's trembling hands and pressed it against Adan's forehead. "Then let me learn," she said through clenched teeth. "Leave this girl alone." Adan's body arched as another wave of black smoke poured out of her mouth. The spirits let out an ear-piercing shriek. They fought. They resisted. But Baba Chukudi did not stop. He lifted his hands, his voice rising like thunder. "By the power of the ancestors, by the fire of the Most High. Begone." The shadows let out one final scream, a horrible, inhuman sound that rattled the very walls. And then, they vanished. The room fell still. The air cleared. The lights stabilized. Adan's body collapsed onto the bed, her breathing ragged but normal. The mark on her stomach faded, as though it had never been there. Dr. Okafor took a shaky breath, staring at her hands, still trembling from what she had done. Nkechi wept openly, gripping Adan's now warm fingers. Baba Chukudi wiped his forehead, exhaustion settling into his old bones. "The battle is over," he murmured. But his voice carried a weight that none of them missed. "But the war is not. Justice comes in strange ways." The first rays of dawn crept through the hospital blinds, bathing the room in soft, golden light. The atmosphere had changed, It no longer felt heavy, no longer carried the oppressive weight of unseen forces lurking in the shadows. A gentle breeze rustled the curtains, as though the ancestors themselves had passed through, leaving behind a sense of peace. Dr. Okafor sat in her office, flipping through Adan's medical records, though she already knew the truth. The young woman's body had endured something beyond science, something that no test or medical equipment could explain. Still, she needed to see it with her own eyes. She stood and made her way to Adan's ward. A miracle in the morning. When dear Okafor entered, she found Nurse Amoka and Nkechi by Adan's bedside, both of them staring in quiet awe. Adan was awake. Not just awake, glowing. Her skin, which had been pale and lifeless, now radiated with a soft, healthy warmth. The dark circles under her eyes were gone, replaced by a brightness that had not been there before. She looked reborn. Adan blinked, looking around as if seeing the world anew. I feel different. Nkechi sobbed in relief, clutching her hand. You're back, Adan. You're back. Dr. Okafor moved closer, her experienced hands examining her patient. No wounds. No marks. No sign of the terrible creatures that had once fed on her flesh. It was as though none of it had ever happened. Dr. Okafor exhaled, stepping back. Scientifically, this makes no sense. Baba Chokudi chuckled from the corner of the room. That is because this is not science's victory. The words hung in the air. For once, Dr. Okafor did not argue. She had seen the impossible with her own eyes. The streets hold their own justice. Later that afternoon, Adan, now strong enough to stand, walked slowly through the hospital corridor, Nkechi beside her. They were preparing to leave, though a part of Adan would never truly leave what had happened behind. Baba Chokudi walked ahead, his staff tapping lightly against the floor as he guided them toward the exit. Dr. Okafor and Nurse Amoka followed, each still in quiet reflection of the night that had changed them forever. Then, a commotion outside the hospital gates. People were gathered, murmuring in hushed, excited voices. The sound of laughter and whispers rippled through the street. A beggar, dressed in expensive but tattered clothes, was hunched over a garbage bin, shoving spoiled food into his mouth with frantic hands. His once well-groomed beard was now tangled and unkempt, his fine suit covered in dust and filth. He was muttering to himself, his eyes wide, unfocused. The crowd whispered. Isn't that Obina? It can't be. He was so wealthy. Just yesterday, he was driving the latest car, wearing gold chains. Adan's breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. The man who had taken from her. Obina. But he was no longer the confident, powerful man who had once promised her wealth in exchange for her dignity. He was broken. Dr. Okafor's eyes widened in shock. Nkechi gasped, stepping back. Nurse Amoka pressed a hand to her mouth. How? Baba Chokudi simply watched silently for a moment before nodding knowingly. He tried to take her soul for his wealth, he said, his voice calm, but the spirits have taken his mind instead. Adan's legs trembled, but this time, not from fear. It was justice. She stepped forward, looking down at the man who had once controlled her fate. Obina lifted his head slightly, his once arrogant eyes now empty, lost. For a fleeting moment, a spark of recognition flickered in his gaze. He opened his mouth, as if to speak. Then he laughed. A loud, unhinged laugh, the sound of a man who would never know reality again. The spirits had judged him. Adan took a slow breath, then turned away. She had no more words for him. A new path. As they walked away, Nkechi spoke softly. Adan, what will you do now? Adan tilted her face toward the sun, letting the warm light touch her skin. I will warn others, she said. I will tell them what I learned. She turned to Baba Chokudi, her voice steady. No one should ever trade their dignity for temporary gain. The price is always higher than it seems. Baba Chokudi nodded approvingly. The spirits have given you a second chance, he said. Use it wisely. Adan smiled, a real, genuine smile. She had walked through the darkest night. But now, she was walking toward light. And she would never look back. The end.